The revolving doors of the Stanton Equity Building whispered shut behind Chloe Reeves as she stepped inside, the quiet click of her heels absorbed by the polished marble floors that stretched out like a sea of glass beneath the morning light. She stood for a brief second, adjusting the strap of her modest beige tote bag, her fingers smoothing the lapel of her pale blue coat. Not out of vanity, but in an unconscious effort to maintain composure. Around her, the lobby buzzed with quiet luxury. Floral arrangements taller than most people, a concierge desk carved from deep walnut, and the steady, precise rhythm of designer shoes echoing down the corridors. Chloe, 26, with clear eyes and hair pulled back in a loose knot, didn't look like she belonged here. At least not in the way the others waiting for their interviews did. They were dressed like walking resumes, sleek, pressed, practiced. She looked like someone who had taken the subway, which she had. She looked like someone who had ironed her dress on a kitchen table, which she had. But there was something grounded in the way she held herself. Something still, watchful. The receptionist glanced up from her screen, her smile faltering as she took in Chloe's unbranded coat and time-worn shoes. "Can I help you?" she asked, the kind of tone people use when they assume you're lost. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock interview, strategy division," Chloe replied, her voice soft but steady. A pause. The receptionist scrolled through a list and handed her a visitor's badge, squinting at her screen. "Conference room B, down the hall, second left." Chloe nodded her thanks and walked toward the elevator bank, passing others who glanced up from their phones just long enough to register her presence. Or, more precisely, to dismiss it. One young man in a navy overcoat leaned toward a sleek-looking blonde and murmured, "Did they open applications to the interns, cousins?" They both smirked. Chloe heard it but didn't flinch. She simply clutched her notepad a little tighter, the same one she had used for years, filled with margin notes and old ink stains. She had prepared for this moment not in boardrooms or business schools, but in silence, in long nights working double shifts, in the quiet resilience of those who are used to not being seen. The conference room was cooler than the hallway, the kind of air-conditioned chill that seeped past fabric and into skin, and Chloe instinctively pulled her sleeves down a little further as she stepped inside. A long glass table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs already half occupied by a group of sharply dressed candidates who were leaning back with the easy confidence of those who had done this before. Probably many times. They glanced up briefly when she entered, then quickly returned to their screens and private conversations, some sipping coffee from eco-luxury branded cups, others scrolling through notes on gleaming tablets. No one greeted her. Chloe selected a chair near the end of the table and quietly sat down, carefully placing her notebook, pen, and a small battered folder in front of her. For a moment, she allowed herself to take in the space. The sleek matte black walls, the city skyline, glittering just beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The discreet clock on the wall ticking toward 10:03. A woman in a structured blazer entered then, her heels clicking with precision, followed by a man holding a tablet and a stack of printed case studies. The room quieted. "Thank you all for being here," the woman said without much warmth, barely glancing at them. "I'm Cassandra Weir, Director of Strategy. We'll be assessing group interaction, idea development, and real-time problem solving. Consider this your only round." Her eyes swept across the room, pausing on each candidate to flicker longer on Chloe, before she turned to the man beside her. "David will distribute your case. You'll have 10 minutes to review, then we begin." The stack was passed around, a crisp printed scenario titled Market Expansion Initiative, South American Division. Chloe accepted her copy silently and began to read. It was familiar, eerily so, and halfway down the second page, a line caught her breath. A mention of a failed logistics attempt in São Paulo in 2019. She had written a research paper about that very failure during her final year of undergrad, a paper she'd crafted late into the night while working 2 part-time jobs and caring for her grandmother. She made a quick margin note. Around her, the conversation had already begun. "We push the aggressive acquisition strategy," one man declared. "Volume over trust," said another, tapping his pen like a metronome. Cassandra nodded as they spoke, occasionally asking for clarification, but otherwise letting the candidates compete for the floor. Chloe listened. The discussion was spirited but shallow, full of jargon and energy but lacking precision. She waited until Cassandra turned directly to her. Miss Reeves, we haven't heard your thoughts. All eyes turned to Chloe, some curious, others already amused. She cleared her throat. I think most of these strategies fail to account for local relationship-based business culture, she began, her voice measured but calm. The model you've presented is nearly identical to the Nordgren case from 2019. They entered with scale, underestimated local partnerships, and suffered a 27% drop in market retention within the first year. Someone snorted. Where'd you get that, a YouTube video? Chloe met his gaze without blinking. Harvard Business Review, November 2020 issue. The room fell briefly quiet. Cassandra arched a brow. Continue. Chloe did, citing 2 other examples, then suggesting a strategy that involved joint ventures with mid-level regional firms rather than top-down acquisition. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was informed, cautious, real. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was different now. Heavier, more thoughtful. That is, until the man who had mocked her earlier leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Okay, sure, he said, but this is Stanton Equity. We don't exactly build empires with hand-holding and compromise. Laughter, light but sharp. Cassandra said nothing. Another candidate, a woman with a stiff blonde bob, murmured, It's idealistic. Sweet, but kind of naive. Chloe smiled faintly but said nothing more. Cassandra glanced at her watch. Take a 15-minute break. We'll resume with role-based simulation. Chloe stood slowly, gathering her things. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught a reflection of herself in the polished glass, hair slightly out of place, expression unreadable. Behind her, the others laughed again, their voices carrying louder now that the door was open. It wasn't rage she felt, it wasn't even shame. It was something colder, a dull recognition. The room had heard her, they just hadn't wanted to listen. The hallway outside the conference room was lined with modern art prints. Cold, abstract shapes on white backgrounds that seemed to echo the corporate detachment of the entire building. Chloe stood by a window that overlooked a sterile rooftop terrace below, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the sill, the other hand loosely holding her notebook. The 15-minute break, it turned out, was not really for resting. It was a staging area, a social gauntlet through which each candidate navigated by asserting themselves louder, smarter, more confidently than the last. The man who had mocked her earlier, his name was Eric, she had caught that much, was in the corner speaking animatedly with Cassandra, leaning just close enough to suggest familiarity, his laugh sharp and practiced. Another group had formed near the coffee station, where 2 women and a tall man discussed networking events, throwing out names of professors, executive mentors, and private clubs like confetti. Chloe remained apart, choosing not to hover or insert herself where she clearly wasn't welcome. When the break ended, they returned to the conference room, but this time there were name placards on the table, assigned seats. Hers was at the far end, directly facing Cassandra. As everyone settled, Cassandra stood, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Now, she said, you'll each be assigned roles within a simulated executive team. Your goal is to negotiate an internal restructuring after a failed acquisition. She began assigning positions: CFO, legal counsel, director of HR, global marketing lead. Chloe received the title of junior risk analyst, the lowest-ranking role in the room. She gave no visible reaction, but inside, something shifted. The simulation began, and almost immediately the same dynamics resumed. Eric, assigned the CEO role, took control of the conversation with the bravado of someone used to being obeyed. He gestured, interrupted, overruled. Others chimed in, some with conviction, others just enough to be noticed. Chloe listened quietly, analyzing the numbers in the fictional brief, which most of the group had only skimmed. At one point, she raised her hand slightly, her voice soft but clear. The numbers don't support a continuation of the Brazil expansion. If you look at the net operational cost and weigh it against the projected ROI after restructuring, there's a 14.6% shortfall that hasn't been accounted for. Silence followed. Then laughter. Eric shook his head. Junior analysts don't interrupt CEOs mid-flow, sweetheart. That's not how chain of command works. Another woman chuckled and added, We'll let you present your calculations after the executives finish vision casting. Chloe nodded once slowly and leaned back in her chair. Cassandra remained impassive, taking notes. The simulation continued for 20 more minutes, during which Chloe remained largely silent, but her pen was never still. She annotated, recalculated, traced consequences of decisions being thrown around the room, as if they were theoretical game pieces rather than models with real implications. At the end of the exercise, Cassandra asked for a final proposal summary. Eric stood up confidently and delivered a rousing speech about aggressive expansion, lean cuts, and brand dominance. It was polished, vague, and completely unsupported by numbers. As he finished, he turned to Chloe with a smirk. Our analyst has a breakdown of projections to support this strategy. All eyes turned to her. Chloe didn't move. She looked at the table, then up at Cassandra. I'm sorry, she said, voice measured but firm. I can't support the proposal. The data contradicts it on every front. I wasn't consulted, and I won't validate something just because I was told to. A beat of silence followed, and then Eric laughed again. You're really going to burn your chances in front of the hiring panel over pride? Chloe replied, over facts. Cassandra, who had been still throughout, finally spoke. Thank you, Miss Reeves. You may step out while we deliberate. Chloe rose, collected her notes and placard, and exited without looking back. As the door closed behind her, she exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of clarity and quiet devastation. She knew what had just happened. She had been placed at the bottom, then invited to betray herself to climb one rung higher. And when she refused, she became a threat. Not because she was wrong, but because she made them uncomfortable. Chloe sat alone on a bench beside the building's east-facing atrium, a narrow glass corridor that caught the afternoon light in delicate, shimmering patterns across the marble floor. Her notebook lay closed in her lap now, her fingers resting lightly on its worn cover, as she stared out through the glass at the rooftops of Manhattan, where steam curled from vents and the world below moved with the same indifferent rhythm it always had. She had been told to wait, not with the others, but separately in this oddly quiet corridor that felt more like an airport terminal than part of a corporate high-rise. For a moment, she wondered if this was a silent way of being dismissed, of letting her exit unnoticed through some side door where no one would have to acknowledge her again. But then she reminded herself she hadn't come for their validation. She had come to speak with her own voice, and that at the very least she had done. Still, doubt crept in like a draft through a loose window, soft, invisible, and persistent. What if she had been wrong? Not about the numbers, but about everything else. Her place here. Her hope that knowledge and conviction might weigh more than performance and polish. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A text from her grandmother, just one line. Made you soup for later. No matter what happens, you'll always be my brilliant girl. Chloe smiled faintly, the sting behind her eyes immediate and unexpected. That kind of love was grounding, yes, but it was also painful, because it reminded her how much she wanted to prove that belief right, not just for herself, but for the woman who had raised her. She stood, walked slowly toward the far end of the atrium, and paused near a sculpture. A cold, twisting form of steel and glass that somehow seemed both fragile and unyielding. As she traced its contours with her eyes, she didn't notice the older man approaching until he was just a few feet away. Beautiful, isn't it? He said gently. She turned, startled, then quickly regained composure. It's striking, she replied. The man looked to be in his late 60s, well-dressed but understated. A dark wool coat, a muted scarf, silver-framed glasses. There was something calm and curious in the way he regarded her. You're one of the candidates, I assume, he said. Not as a question, but with the mild certainty of someone who already knew the answer. Chloe nodded. Was, she replied. I think I've already failed whatever test they meant to give. He smiled slightly. There's more than one kind of test in places like this, and not all of them are official. She tilted her head, unsure whether he was being kind or simply vague. May I ask, she said slowly, who you are? He looked amused. Just someone who comes here from time to see what's becoming of the company I helped build. There was a long pause as Chloe took that in. She felt her pulse change, not from fear, but from something more like caution. the awareness that everything she said next might matter more than she realized. "Then I should probably thank you," she said, "for creating a place where people can at least try to be heard." He looked at her thoughtfully. "And did you feel heard today?" She hesitated, then answered, "No, but I didn't come expecting to be heard. I came because I thought I had something worth saying. I still do." The man nodded slowly, his gaze narrowing as if seeing her more clearly now. "You know," he said, "I started as a risk analyst. They used to laugh when I spoke up too. Thought I didn't understand the game. The truth is, I just didn't like playing it the way they did." Chloe looked at him, her expression shifting, the tension in her jaw softening. "So, what changed?" He smiled again, this time with the quiet weight of memory. Eventually, someone stopped laughing. He extended his hand. "Charles Rowe." She blinked. The name meant nothing for half a second. And then it landed, heavy and electric. One of the original partners. The Rowe in Stanton Equity. She took his hand slowly, her voice quieter now. "Chloe Reeves." He nodded. "Well, Miss Reeves, I have a meeting to attend shortly, but I wanted to say, your instincts are sound. And in this place, that's rarer than you think. Don't apologize for thinking differently." As he turned and walked away, Chloe remained still, not with the weight of intimidation, but with something more complex. A spark of validation that didn't scream, but rather hummed quietly inside her. Steady and solid. For the first time that day, she didn't feel like a mistake in the wrong room. She felt like a message that hadn't yet been understood. The receptionist barely looked up when Chloe returned to the main floor, but this time, her badge had been replaced with a temporary red one, slightly different from the white cards the other candidates still wore. It wasn't a demotion, but it wasn't nothing either. It was the kind of small visual change that people in places like Stanton Equity use to communicate status without ever saying a word. She clipped it to her coat anyway and crossed the atrium again. This time not toward the waiting area where the others still lingered, but toward the executive wing where she had been told to report. The hallway changed subtly as she moved. Fewer posters, quieter colors, and lighting that felt warmer, more expensive, as though the air itself understood that things of consequence happened here. A junior assistant met her outside a large set of frosted glass doors and motioned her into a smaller, sunlit room that overlooked the city. A coffee cart stood in the corner, untouched. One long table was set with folders, a tablet, and a pitcher of water. No one else was there. Chloe took a seat, unsure what to expect. She had no title now. No clear role in this strange, liminal space between rejection and something else. And the ambiguity settled on her shoulders with a strange weight of possibility. When the door opened a few minutes later, Cassandra entered first, her demeanor unchanged. Polished, unreadable, professional, in the way that left no room for warmth. Behind her came two other figures. One man, tall, bald, sharp-eyed, and a woman in a dove-gray suit who moved with an elegance that suggested she wasn't used to being interrupted. Cassandra began without ceremony. "Miss Reeves, we've invited you here to clarify a few points regarding your performance in the simulation. This is Mr. Levinson, head of legal strategy, and Ms. Brooks from the executive board." Chloe nodded politely, her heart thudding not with fear but with alertness. This wasn't over. It had never been over. Levinson spoke first, his tone brisk. "Your refusal to support the majority proposal raised some internal discussion. Can you explain your rationale again, as concisely as possible?" Chloe did, with no dramatic embellishment. Only numbers, logic, risk projections, and a clear articulation of consequences. She was halfway through when the door opened again, and Eric strode in, coat over his arm, smirking as if summoned to accept an award. "Hope I'm not late," he said, eyes flicking briefly toward Chloe before settling on Ms. Brooks, whom he greeted with a casual familiarity that made Chloe realize they'd met before, possibly more than once. Cassandra said nothing but motioned for him to sit. Ms. Brooks folded her hands on the table. "Miss Reeves," she said, "Eric has raised some concerns about your ability to work within a team dynamic. He indicated you declined to collaborate, chose confrontation, and disrupted the exercise." Chloe turned slightly to face her, her voice calm. "I was given the role of analyst. I did the analysis. I raised flags. I wasn't heard, and I wasn't included in the development of the final proposal. When asked to endorse it, I declined. That isn't disruption. That's integrity. For the first time, Ms. Brooks's expression changed, a small flicker of curiosity behind her composure. "Eric," she said, "you had access to the same projections. Why didn't you factor in the risk she outlined?" Eric shrugged, still smiling. "It's a simulation. I assumed we were prioritizing assertiveness, bold leadership, not caution." Levinson tilted his head. "So you disregarded projected losses because you didn't think they were part of the test?" "I disregarded overcaution," Eric replied smoothly. "We're not hiring accountants. We're hiring people who can own a room." Chloe said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was not in her disfavor. Ms. Brooks tapped her fingers once, then looked at Cassandra. "I'd like to hear Miss Reeves in a different environment," she said. "Put her in the round table tomorrow. Board prep session. No observers. Let's see how she works when the table isn't stacked." Eric blinked, his smile faltering just slightly. Cassandra nodded once. "Understood." Chloe, still seated, absorbed the moment slowly, aware that the tide had shifted not through protest, not through performance, but by remaining steady while others scrambled for control. As the meeting ended and the others stood to leave, Eric paused by her chair. "Don't let this go to your head," he murmured. "It's still a long game." She looked up at him with a kind of stillness that was almost ancient, older than the room, older than their conversation. "That's fine," she said. "I'm not here to play a short one." He left without another word, and for the first time since she'd entered this building, she was alone in a room she had not been expected to reach. The next morning arrived not with a sense of triumph, but with a sharp clarity that Chloe had felt only a few times in her life. Moments just before an exam she knew she had prepared for. Moments standing at the edge of uncertainty with nothing but her own mind to rely on. The boardroom was colder than she remembered, though maybe it was simply her skin noticing more. The same long table stretched out before her, now scattered with materials labeled preparatory review. But the atmosphere was different. There were fewer people and the air felt denser, as if weighted by consequence. She had been invited to join, not as an observer, but as a voice at the table, a trial participant among executives twice her age, whose entire careers had been built on moving numbers, shaping narratives, and reading people before they had spoken a word. No one introduced her this time. No one coddled her presence with soft language or lowered expectations. They spoke around her, beside her, across from her, expecting she would either rise into the moment or disappear within it. The meeting began with projections, discussions about underperforming regions, ethical concerns raised by partner vendors, and the inevitable clash between aggressive growth and long-term sustainability. Chloe spoke once early, a small correction about a logistics model one man had cited, referencing a more recent study that quietly invalidated his numbers. He had blinked, hesitated, and then said, "I hadn't seen that." She nodded once and moved on. And then, gradually, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not like in movies, but like a room slowly warming from sunlight. People began to address her directly, asking for clarification, referencing her earlier remarks. Someone passed her a revised version of the report and said, "Would you mind marking your suggestions on this?" She did. Quietly. Precisely. By the time the conversation reached its final round, how to handle a sensitive internal restructuring in the European branch, Chloe had already spoken 4 times, each more deliberate than the last. When she gave her final recommendation, it was with the careful weight of someone who had not come to impress, but to contribute meaningfully. There was a pause after she finished. Then Ms. Brooks, seated at the head, looked to the others and said, "We'll move forward with this direction. Make sure the draft reflects her framework." There was no ceremony, no applause, just a line drawn across silence, and then, "That concludes today's prep." As the others gathered their materials and left in pairs or small clusters, Cassandra approached Chloe, a faint smile on her face for the first time. Not warm, not congratulatory, but respectful. "You held your line," she said. "That's rarer than you think." Chloe looked at her, surprised, but nodded. I wasn't trying to win. Cassandra's eyes narrowed slightly. That's why you did. Just then, the door opened again, and Charles Rowe entered. Not dramatically, but with a quietness that made those who remained fall silent. He walked to the far end of the table, looked around, and then said, "Before we close the room, there's one more thing." He turned toward Chloe. "Miss Reeves, effective immediately, you are being appointed chair of the Internal Ethics and Strategy Review Panel. A new body we've been waiting to form until we found someone who could speak without flattery and listen without fear." The room stilled. Chloe blinked once, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. Charles continued, "Your title will be formalized this week. You'll report directly to the board. Your desk is on the 39th floor." He offered a small, understated nod, then turned to leave without waiting for applause or questions. The others followed, one by one, some exchanging brief glances, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Chloe stood still for a long time until the room was empty again. Then she reached for her notebook, held it in both hands, and breathed. Not deeply, not dramatically. Just enough to feel the weight shift. That evening, the train ride back to Brooklyn felt slower than usual, the rhythm of the wheels against the tracks echoing not as background noise but as quiet punctuation to everything that had happened. Chloe sat by the window, her coat folded neatly on her lap, one hand resting atop her old notebook, now soft at the corners from years of use. Outside, the city passed by in blurred streaks of orange and violet, streetlights flickering on as the sun slipped behind rooftops and water towers. She watched it all in silence, not smiling, not replaying events, just breathing it in like cool air after a long day spent indoors. When she reached her stop, the walk home was familiar. A stretch of cracked sidewalks, the smell of baked bread from the corner shop, and the soft golden glow of windows where lives went on without anyone knowing what had changed in hers. The building was quiet when she entered, the stairwell creaking as always, and from the open kitchen door came the sound of a spoon against a pot. Her grandmother didn't look up when Chloe stepped in. She simply said, "You're late," in that particular tone that contained neither judgment nor worry, but routine care wrapped in dry affection. Chloe stepped behind her, pressed a hand gently to her shoulder, and replied, "I had a meeting." Her grandmother finally turned, her eyes scanning Chloe's face, pausing not at her expression but at the way she held herself. Something straighter, steadier, unspoken. "You did what you came to do?" she asked. Chloe nodded. "And more than that." Her grandmother hummed softly, turning back to the stove. "Then sit down. The soup's still hot." Chloe sat at the small wooden table where she'd eaten every meal since she was a teenager, the surface marked with years of use. Coffee rings, pen scratches, flour smudges that never fully came out. She placed the notebook beside her bowl, opened it slowly, and on a fresh page wrote one line without pause. "Be the voice, even when they expect silence." She didn't need to say anything else. The room was warm, the light was soft, and for the first time in a long time, she felt not like someone trying to break in, but like someone who had already built a door where there hadn't been one before.